Well, thank you. It's very good to be here. I've been a member of the Society since, I think, 1981, so it feels like home. I'm speaking today about psi in everyday life. And I think this is important because my main theme, and one of the main themes of my own research over the last 30 years, has been that psychic phenomena are normal, not paranormal, natural, not supernatural. They're part of our biological nature. And I think that the classification of them as paranormal has done great harm to this field. Personally, I don't like the word parapsychology. It means beyond psychology. I think these are part of psychology and part of the normal. I think the idea that paranormal has really played into the hands of the critics of this field of research and stokes their prejudices. As you all know, this field of research arouses extremely strong prejudices and often very emotional responses in people who actually know very little about the evidence. And often in the media it's portrayed in a kind of spooky music, green lights, ectoplasm, fake seances, ghosts, poltergeists, and that's the way it's portrayed. And it arouses this extreme emotional opposition. Many of the so-called skeptics, who are basically psi deniers, are people who know very little about the evidence. And if you look at the website Skeptical About Skeptics, which I recommend, is spelt with the K as in the American way, it includes some reports of skeptical conventions written by reporters who infiltrated them undercover. The latest one is written by Ian Filtrator, and what these reports show is that at these skeptical congresses, most people simply know nothing about the evidence and aren't interested in it. At one of them in London a few years ago, Susan Blackmore was giving a talk, and there were about 1,000 people in the audience. They have far bigger audiences than we do. And she asked the people who'd read the literature of psychic research or parapsychology how many had actually studied the evidence. And about 3 hands went up out of 1,000 people. I know this is true because I've had many encounters with skeptics. Recently, 2 or 3 years ago with Daniel Dennett, the noted materialist philosopher and fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And I asked him, since he was so against psychic phenomena, if he'd like to take part in a public debate with me so we could actually thrash out what the issues were. And he refused. And I said, well, why? And he said, because that would mean I'd have to read the evidence. And I said, well, you know, if you have such a strong opinion without reading the evidence, Dan, there's a name for that. It's called prejudice. He got terribly angry, and it triggers off very strong emotional reactions among people who consider themselves to be defenders of science and reason. It brings out an extremely unscientific and irrational response in otherwise intelligent people. Why is this so? One reason is because psychic phenomena contradict one of the assumptions of the materialist belief system, which I discuss in my book, The Science Delusion, called Science Set Free in America. One of the 10 dogmas of contemporary materialistic belief system is that psychic phenomena are impossible. And that's because another of the dogmas is that mind is the brain. Minds are what brains do. Therefore, it's all inside the head. Therefore, it's impossible for your thoughts to influence someone at a distance or to have an effect on objects at a distance. Therefore, all the evidence for psychic phenomena must be fraudulent or as a result of error or misunderstanding or statistical glitches or something. But this prejudice actually goes back a lot further. And I think it helps us to understand the depth of the opposition when we see how deep its roots go. In England, when I studied this history, I found it goes back to at least to the 16th century. In the 16th century, it was after the Reformation, laws were passed in England against witchcraft. there had been no laws during the Middle Ages. A few people had been prosecuted for murder and accused of doing it by witchcraft, but there were no specific laws against witchcraft. Within 20 or 30 years, a skeptical attitude had developed to this, which was summarized in the book in 1584 by Reginald Scott, called The Discovery of Witchcraft. And in this book, Scott argued that witchcraft didn't really exist. There was no need to get hysterical about it because it was impossible. And there were 4 reasons that people could be accused of witchcraft. Firstly, they could be mad or deluded. Secondly, they could be accused out of malice to try and libel them. Thirdly, they could be malicious people who brought about bad effects by normal means, such as poison. And fourthly, they could be frauds, pretending to have powers they didn't really have to make money. Now, these are basically the skeptical arguments which we still hear today, and that was in 1584. These arguments spread in England until, by the end of the 17th century, it was virtually impossible to get convictions for witchcraft. Juries and magistrates would not convict people of witchcraft because they didn't think it was possible. They thought the best way of dealing with it is to say it doesn't exist. So the things witches were supposed to do, like cast the evil eye on people, bringing about bad effects through a look, a malicious look, were simply considered not to be possible. In 1736, the English Parliament passed the Witchcraft Act. And the Witchcraft Act was not what it might sound like. The Witchcraft Act was a law abolishing all laws against witchcraft and replacing with 2 new laws. One was making it an offence to pretend to be a witch, and the other offence was to accuse someone of witchcraft. This assumption was that it wasn't possible. And this created an atmosphere of skepticism about paranormal powers in England. When David Hume put forward his famous arguments against miracles in the 18th century, his argument basically was miracles are things which happen very, very rarely, and it's much more likely that people who say these rare and unlikely things have happened are telling lies than that they really happened. What we should trust is normal events that common sense would persuade us are the normal course of nature. And many skeptics to this day, so-called skeptics, or rather deniers, still use Hume's arguments as knockdown arguments against psychic phenomena. But the reality is utterly different. And what I'm going to try and show now, or summarize, is that these phenomena are extraordinarily normal and natural. I'm going to start with the feeling of being stared at. I myself got interested in this, as I mentioned yesterday, through being interested in the nature of vision. When we see something, obviously there are changes in the eye and the brain, but where is the image we're seeing? Where is my image of you and your image of me? Is it inside your head, which is the official view, the materialist view, or is it where it seems to be? Well, I'm suggesting it's where it seems to be. This theory is so simple it's hard to grasp. That your image of me is in your mind, but it's not inside your head. It's actually right here where I am. You're projecting out your images through perceptual fields, which I think are a kind of morphic field. I'm not going to go into the theory, I'm just telling you the reasoning behind this, for me, that you're projecting out these images which coincide with what you're looking at. Your mind, in a sense, reaches out to touch what you're looking at. I therefore concluded that if this is true, it should be testable. And when you look at a person from behind and they don't know you're there, would it be possible for them to tell that they're being looked at? And as soon as I asked that question, I thought, well, of course, I've had that experience. I've turned around and people have been looking at me, or I've looked at people and they've looked straight back. So I did surveys to find out how common this was, and I looked in the literature, and it turns out that over 90% of the population have had this experience, either of looking at someone else and then turning around, or turning around and finding someone's looking at them. It's extremely common, and I imagine most people in this room would have had that experience. And let's see how many actually have. How many people have felt they're being stared at? Or felt, yes, well, it's certainly a majority, common. So what does science have to tell us about this? Well, until the 1980s, virtually nothing. Even psychical researchers had ignored this phenomenon, I think partly because of the extremely strong taboo against the evil eye as a form of superstition, and also the materialist assumption it's all in the brain makes this impossible. So it's just a superstition or a coincidence. Well, I looked into the natural history of it. I collect a database of stories from people and about animals. I now have about 10,000 case histories on my very extensive databases. They still come in several a week, and my assistant, Pam Smart, puts these onto our computerized database. And many of them concern the feeling of being stared at. And it's interesting that from my own experience and that of many other people, it's not just an undifferentiated feeling of unease. It has a directional component. For example, once I was looking at a woman who was calling at our house. I admit I found her rather attractive. I was looking out of an upstairs window as she got out of her car. She didn't know I was there. And I must have felt my gaze because she suddenly looked, and she looked straight up at me. It wasn't just a feeling of unease. It was just it was a directional response. So there's more to it than just feeling uneasy. I interviewed with my assistants surveillance officers, the drug squad at Heathrow, the store detectives at Harrods, private detective training officers, or people whose profession it is to watch others. Most of us are amateurs, but for some people it's a profession. And it was clear that all of them took it for granted. This is a real phenomenon. In the British SAS, when people are being trained how to stab people in the back, they're trained when you creep up behind someone to stab them in the back. You don't stare at their back, because if you do, they're likely to feel you coming, turn round and shoot you. In the martial arts, you can actually train to become more sensitive to being looked at. Well, there have now been many experiments on this phenomenon, mostly conducted in schools, because they're experiments so simple a child can do them, and thousands of children already have. The results are overwhelmingly significant. The sense of being stared at in trials where people are blindfolded and either looked at or not looked at in a random sequence. They have to guess if they're being looked at or not. The results show a relatively small but highly significant effect. There's been hundreds of thousands of these trials. This research is summarized in a paper I wrote in a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies in 2005, devoted to the sense of being stared at. The whole issue was about it. This has been running as a big experiment in the Amsterdam Science Museum for 20 years, one of the largest experiments ever conducted in this field, showing overwhelmingly significant results. The most sensitive subjects are children under the age of 10. And I think most of us become rather thick-skinned about this, as it were, living in crowded cities, but children are more sensitive. And the sensitivity of people varies. Some are more sensitive than others. And according to police officers I interviewed, criminals become extremely sensitive to this when they're about to commit a crime. They become much more vigilant. And people become much more vigilant when they're in situations of danger, walking down a dark street at night in a dangerous part of town. People are much more sensitive than when they feel secure. Anyway, here's a phenomenon which is known all over the world, in every culture, extremely common. Most people have experienced it. I think it's a psi phenomenon. It can't be explained by normal means. You can do these experiments through one-way mirrors, through windows at a distance, and even through closed-circuit television. The skin resistance of people being watched on CCTV is measurably different, significantly different when they're being watched and when they're not being watched. This has now been done in several different labs in different countries. And a number of skeptics have investigated this and have obtained positive results, which they then tried to explain away. I discuss all this, and they discuss it themselves, in the special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies on the sense of being stared at. It happens in animals too. I interviewed wildlife photographers and hunters to see if animals have this sensitivity. People who do deer stalking, for example, deliberately try not to give the deer any clue of their whereabouts by sound or smell. And it's a common experience in that world that if you're focusing through the sights of your rifle on an animal, when you've got it in your sights, you have to shoot quickly, because if you don't, it'll run away. It'll feel it somehow. Wildlife photographers do the same. We interviewed the top 30 wildlife photographers who were all winners in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year contest a few years ago, and practically all of them said that they'd noticed when they were filming animals from a hide, Americans call it a blind, they were using telephoto lenses, the animals couldn't see them. If they got them in their sights, they had to take the picture quickly because they seemed to pick up when they were being watched, even from a distance with a telephoto lens. It seems to be very common in the animal kingdom, and I think it may well have evolved in the context of predator-prey relationships. Any prey animal that could tell when it was being watched by a hidden predator would escape better than one that couldn't tell. So there'd be a natural selection for this sensitivity. There's virtually no work on this by naturalists or natural historians, people who work on natural history, because there's a taboo about this phenomenon, and it's been ignored by zoologists. It would be quite possible to do simple experiments with cats and mice, for example. In fact, I tried one myself. Unfortunately, it didn't work because I had to use a gerbil instead of a mouse. My wife objected to my having mice in the house. And so I had to borrow the gerbil that belonged to one of my son's friends. This was when they were quite young. We were asked to look after it while they were at school. So I had a situation where I had a one-way mirror, a cat on one side, a gerbil in a cage on the other, a video camera on the gerbil, and a piece of cardboard that I could move up and down to block the view of the cat and at random intervals. And the idea was, would the gerbil behave differently when being watched by this cat? Well, it didn't. And then I did the control experiment without any interposed barriers, and the cat went right up to the cage with claws pressing against the cage, and the gerbil just came up and sniffed its nose. It turned out this gerbil lived with a large Labrador dog and was quite unafraid of other animals. Well, anyway, under more favorable conditions, in situations where my wife isn't there, it would be possible to do experiments with archetypal predator-prey situations with cats and mice. And it also applies to the animals that they're most vulnerable when they're sleeping. And sleeping animals can apparently be woken up by being stared at, and so can sleeping babies. Renee Haynes, who used to edit the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research, in her book, what's it called, The Seeing Eye, or something, or The Mind's Eye, tells a story of how when her son, now Sir Crispin Tickell, the noted diplomat, when he was a baby, how when she went into his room at night, she avoided staring at him because it would wake him up. Many parents avoid staring at their babies once they've got them to sleep because they're afraid of waking them up. And she said in the morning, when she did want to wake him up, she went to his room and stared at him, and it woke up, and she described it as more humane than the cold sponge method. I'm now trying to encourage people to do research with their pets, and the slogan for this is, "Don't let sleeping dogs lie." Stare at them and see if you can wake them up. And this could be done in the comfort of people's homes using readily available video technology. So I think this is an extremely common experience. It's a psi phenomenon. It has a perfectly natural evolutionary background. It's part of our animal nature. It's not something special to humans. It's normal, not paranormal. The second phenomenon I want to talk about is telepathy. In my own work on morphic fields and the way they organize groups of animals, I think that the whole group of animals, like a flock of birds or a school of fish, is within a field of the whole group. So it's a nested hierarchy of fields. There's a field for cells, there's a field for tissues, organs, organisms, societies of organisms. So the whole society has a field, as it were, around it. And I think that's why the flocks of starlings and schools of fish can change direction very rapidly without bumping into each other. Not only do they need to know where their neighbours are, they need to know where their neighbours are going to go. And they can coordinate this in an extraordinarily amazing way. And this, again, is a totally natural phenomenon. There's good models of this now. The best computer models treat the entire flock as a field. They use a combination of off-the-shelf algorithms for modeling magnetic fields and modeling hydrodynamical fields of flowing fluids, and treating the whole flock as a field within which the individuals are influenced by the field, like magnetic domains are influenced by the field of the whole magnet. The magnetic field, as it were, emerges from the lined up magnetic domains in a ferromagnet and works back on them. It's something like that. I think that members of social groups are linked through morphic fields. And my interest in telepathy developed because it occurred to me if they're linked through fields, even when they go apart, the field linking members of a group isn't broken, it, as it were, stretches. So when a pack of wolves goes hunting to bring back food for the cubs in the den, even if they go as much as 100 miles away, which they can do in northern Canada, they still remain linked. And so would be able to feel when something's happening to other members of the group at a distance. And there's evidence from naturalists who studied wolves in the wild that they do seem to sense what's going on at distances way beyond the power of smell or hearing. Suggesting telepathic communication. Well, because I think if telepathy exists, it's an animal ability common in social animals, not just something specifically human, I started my research on telepathy with animals. And I started with the animals we know best, namely domesticated animals, particularly cats, dogs, horses, and parrots. I appealed for information to people about their experiences with their animals. Could their animals pick up their intention? Had they any evidence to suggest that they were responding to their thoughts? And I was overwhelmed when I put out these appeals in the newspapers. I started with the Sunday Telegraph, and then I had appeals in the Sun, the Daily Mirror, and a range of other newspapers, similar to what we were just hearing about, appeals for information through the media. When I first started this in the 1980s, I was mainly getting handwritten letters. I now mostly get emails, which are much more convenient for copying and pasting into the database. I soon found that people were observing many phenomena with their animals, and if you just hear one story, it's an anecdote. But I take the view that the plural of anecdote is data. And if you hear hundreds of stories about the same phenomenon from otherwise unconnected people, it suggests that at least lots of people experience this kind of thing with their pets. It doesn't prove they're right about their experience, but it tells you what it's the phenomenon that they're describing is a widespread experience. One of these stories, a very persistent one, was from cat owners saying that their cats seemed to know when they were planning to take it to the vet because the cat would disappear. Cats hate going to vets on the whole, and their cats would not be there when they wanted to find them. So they told me that over and over again, the same kind of story. When this had happened once or twice, they tried to avoid giving any clues to the cat. They wouldn't let it see the carrying basket. They'd avoid saying the word vet. And some of them even tried to avoid thinking about the vet. I mustn't think about the vet. I mustn't think about the vet. The cat still knew. And in despair, some people then took to ringing up the vet to make an appointment from work, so the cat couldn't overhear the conversation on the telephone. And when they got home, they swang by to pick up the cat after work, and it wasn't there. So many of these stories, we did a survey, because these are, of course, self-selected stories, and my research assistant telephoned all 64 veterinary clinics listed in the North London Yellow Pages and asked them if they ever had problems with people missing appointments with cats. 63 out of 64 said, yes, it happens all the time. And the remaining one said, we've given up the appointment system for cats. People just have to turn up with their animals because it was such a nuisance, these missed appointments. Now, that could be turned into an experiment, but the thing that was easiest to test, of which I got many, many reports, was dogs and cats that know when their owners are coming home. I have over 1,000 reports from people of dogs doing this, and about 500 or 600 of cats doing this. And people didn't think it remarkable if it was at a routine time. Nearly all these stories about people who had non-routine jobs, and the people at home often knew when the person was coming because of the behavior of the animal. I have over 30 cases from women saying they know when their husband or partner is coming home. These are people who work irregular hours, like taxi drivers, plumbers, newspaper reporters, lawyers, and so on. Who work irregular hours, and they know when they're coming because the dog goes and sits at the door, so they have time to cook their dinner so it's hot on the table when the man arrives home. Lucky men. So it wasn't the animals picking up from the people, it was the people picking it up from the animals, and it was not at routine times. Then, when I discussed this with my skeptical friend Nicholas Humphrey, who's been a great friend for decades, since we were graduate students at Cambridge together, he's a leading skeptic and formerly a Perrott Warwick senior researcher. Instead of denying the phenomenon, he said, "Oh, my dog used to do that." And I said, "Well, how did you explain it?" I said, "It couldn't have heard you coming from your car from sort of 30 miles away or 20 miles away the other side of Cambridge." He said, "Oh, on the contrary, it just shows what sharp hearing they've got." So I said, "Okay, Nick, well, you know, we try and resolve our differences by experiment. So what about an experiment where you come home at a non-routine time, take the train, for example, cycle home on a borrowed bicycle, so there's no familiar car sounds and no familiar bicycle sounds. Would the dog still know when you were coming?" He said, "Well, of course not." I said, "Well, perhaps it would." And that was the basis for a long series of experiments I did with dogs that know when their owners are coming home. We videotaped the place the animal waited. We had people come at non-routine times, randomly selected. They didn't know them in advance. We had the videotapes. They came in unfamiliar vehicles, taxis, a different taxi each time. That was the most expensive aspect of the research, the taxi bills. And we had them, the videotapes analysed independently by people who didn't know the details of the experiment. And it's pretty obvious when the dog goes to the door or window. This is not a very subjective judgment. Sometimes the dog went to the window when the person wasn't coming home. If a taxi or a car drew up outside, if a cat walked past, you can see that on the video. But we encountered all these so that we couldn't be accused of selective use of the data. And we published this work in peer-reviewed journals. And it's all summarized in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals. This was criticized, of course, by skeptics, and one of them was Richard Wiseman. I invited him to do his own experiments with this dog, and he got virtually the same results as mine. In his experiments, the dog was at the window an average of 4% of the time when the owner was not coming home, and 78% of the time when she was. And it was a significant effect. But he interpreted it differently. He said that because the dog had gone to the window before she came home, it had failed the test. And to look at the rest of the data was a retrospective analysis that was invalid scientifically. And the newspapers blared out headlines: "Psychic dogs fail test," "Psychic dogs fail to give scientists a lead," "Psychic dogs refuted." It was all over the British press. And this has been analysed, this particular controversy has now been analysed by several people, including Robert McLuhan in his book, Randy's Prize. And I think most people agree, even Richard Wiseman, that the data are actually more or less the same as my own. They actually support the same phenomenon. We've done it with other dogs, and many other people have observed this with cats and other animals. Parrots do it too. Some parrots announce the person who's coming home by name before they arrive. Some people have found this happens with horses. We have a few cases of psychic ferrets, guinea pigs, and rabbits. even a few lambs reared by hand that do this. We don't have any psychic goldfish, stick insects, or reptiles. So this phenomenon occurs between animals that bond closely to particular people, and they usually only do it with one person, sometimes with two, but they're people they have to be closely bonded with. So these phenomena, this is one of the telepathic phenomena with animals that I think is very common, and I suspect that if one did experiments with hidden small cameras inside wolf dens, one might see cubs getting excited before the adults return from hunting trips. No one's yet done this, but this kind of phenomenon is very unlikely, I think, to occur only in relation to domestication. I think it probably happens in a whole range of wild animals, often between the young and their owners, and with their parents. So there's a lot of evidence that pets and animals in general are telepathic. And we've done household surveys of this. About 50% of dog owners say that their dogs anticipate the arrival of a member of the family, and about 30% of cat owners. I don't think cats are necessarily less sensitive, they're just less interested in many cases, including, I'm afraid, our own cats, which were a terrible disappointment to me. The phenomenon is common. We're talking about something where there's millions of dogs and cats doing this here in Britain and in many other countries in the world. This is not weird, spooky, green light, paranormal. This is normal. And most pet owners in the surveys we did, we asked whether they thought that they were more psychic than their pet, or the other way around. Most of them, without hesitation, thought that their pet was much more sensitive than they were. I think if we want to get really good, repeatable research with telepathy, it's really good to do it with dogs. You don't get a decline effect with dogs. They never get bored of their owners coming home, and you can do it over and over again. Now, the same kind of phenomena occur with people. And in my databases, where I'm looking at the natural history of telepathy in people, it's nearly always between people who are closely bonded, parents and children, lovers, husbands and wives, best friends, twins, therapists and clients, where there's been transference and countertransference, where there's a strong emotional bond. One of the most natural and biological of these phenomena is telepathy between mothers and babies. I had many reports from nursing mothers or people who had nursed their children saying that when they started leaving their baby and going back to work or started going shopping and that sort of thing, then they would find their milk let down, their breasts would start squeezing out milk, and many women experience them tingling. It's called the milk let down reflex. It's mediated by the hormone oxytocin. For no apparent reason, they'd be a mile or two from the baby, they couldn't hear it, they suddenly feel their milk let down, and when that happens, almost all mothers think, my baby needs me. They don't even think, they just know. And some of them say that their breasts are sentient, or they're like aerials. It's not them thinking of the baby, then their breasts let the milk down. They have the milk let down reflex, then they think of the baby. It's a physiological response. It's an unconscious physiological response. And I've done research on this with surveys, first of all, with nursing mothers. It's quite common. And secondly, I've done research on this with pairs of nursing mothers and babies in London over a 2-month period each. And we found that the milk letdown coincided with the baby needing the mother at non-routine feeding times, with the odds against chance of about 1 billion to 1. This is a highly significant effect. I've been trying to persuade people in colleges of nursing and midwifery to do this for PhD projects. It would make a brilliant PhD project. No one's done it yet, because, as you know, people are afraid anything to do with psychic research might ruin their career. But actually, I think it could make someone's career. YouTube's video, I'm suggesting videotaping the baby. There are now video baby monitors. And the mother could, on a smartphone, do a selfie. My milk's letting down now. ideally, she wouldn't wear breast pads, so you'd see damp patches spreading on the breast. And in a split-screen presentation, this would go viral on YouTube, and it would contribute a great deal of evidence for telepathy in a totally credible biological manner. The commonest kind of telepathy in the modern world is telephone telepathy. Our surveys show that over 80% of the population have had the experience of thinking of someone who then calls on the telephone, or just knowing who it is before they look at the caller ID or pick up the receiver. So this is extraordinarily common, and it's getting commoner because more people have telephones, so smartphones, cell phones are now far more widespread than they used to be. When I was a child in my hometown, Newark, I think there were only about 200, 300 people who had telephones. It was rare to have a phone, and some of them were party lines, so you got other people's calls. Now, virtually everyone has a telephone, practically all the time. And this phenomenon is happening more and more frequently. And exactly the same thing's happening with emails and with text messages. Now, the standard skeptical argument is, well, of course, people think about people sometimes and then they ring and they assume it's telepathy, but it's just a coincidence and they just forget the millions of times they're wrong. When skeptics say that to me, when I first got interested in this about 15 years ago, I heard that argument over and over again. And so I said, well, have you got any evidence about how often people think of other people? No evidence at all. This is an evidence-free hypothesis that had ruled the roost for 100 years since the invention of the telephone without one shred of evidence or research. So I designed a very simple experiment. Some of you have seen this. The basic experiment, the person names 4 people they might be telepathic with. They sit at home with a landline phone, no caller ID. We film them. We pick one of their 4 callers at random and ring them up and ask them to call the subject. They think about them for a moment and then call them. When the phone rings, before they pick it up, they have to guess who's calling. And they say it to camera. I think it's John. They picked up, hello, John. They're right or wrong. They'd be right by chance about 25% of the time, 1 in 4. The average hit rate in our filmed experiments is about 45%, and the p-value's 1 times 10 to the minus 8. And this is more significant than the existence of the Higgs boson, but it got far less attention in the press, as you can imagine. I now have an app. I've developed a new version of this experiment that's running on my website, sheldrake.org, which works on mobile telephones. You register, you put in 2 other people's names and their mobile telephone numbers, and the app does the whole experiment automatically. At a random time, it rings one of the people and says, please think about your friend. And so you think about them, and then when you're ready, you press 1, and the system rings the friend. So if I'm the subject, my phone would ring, the caller ID would say, telephone telepathy test. I answer it, it says, this is your telephone telepathy test. One of your 2 callers is on the line right now. Press 1 for Anne, press 2 for Timothy. And I think, who is it, feel who it is, and press 1. And then if it's Anne, I'm right. If it's Timothy, I'm wrong. So you get instant feedback. And then after a random time delay, it runs another trial. These tests are giving significant above-chance results. And so what I'm hoping with these tests is I find it hard to recruit people here in England. For example, at the Noetic Sciences Conference, I was asked to engage the Noetic Sciences participants in research. I told them about the experiment. I set it up so it worked in America. And people were wildly enthusiastic. But out of about 700 people at the conference, how many actually did the experiment? The answer was 0, because everyone's so busy, to get other people when they, oh, my mother's ill, I've got to, it's really hard to pin people down. I'm now planning to outsource this to India and offer cash incentives for high scores. I'm hoping that through doing this, people will be able to train their intuitive skills, get better at it, And the idea would then be to have national competitions with the finals on television. Who's the most telepathic person in India or the most telepathic person in Britain? And with all the razzmatazz of TV and the media and prizes, a lot of people would be incentivized to practice on their smartphones. There'd be intuition training apps, and to win the prize. And then a few years down the line, we might even have the telepathy Olympics. And people would train for these skills. They train to do gymnastic skills that are otherwise useless just because there's an incentive. If there's an incentive, this could be widely done. And if there were the telepathy Olympics, which of course would have checks against cheating, as any game does, then the skeptic view of this being impossible, or these kinds of phenomena can't exist, there'd still be people who think that, but they'd be completely marginalized. They'd be like the Flat Earth Society, because it would become a social fact. And I think that can really happen. And I think it could happen relatively soon. Now, let me turn now to premonition and precognition. These are very common phenomena. As we've heard already in this conference, J.W. Dunn, in his classic book, An Experiment with Time, showed that when you write down your dreams, and don't forget them, as we usually do, very often they contain elements of events that are going to happen in the next few days. And when I read his book, I was very impressed by this, and by him saying, try it for yourself. I tried it for myself, and within a week, I'd had 3 or 4 startlingly impressive examples of precognitive dreams, so much so that I gave up trying to write them down in the mornings, which was a bit of an effort, because I was convinced this is true. So I think that the precognitive dreams that Dunn showed, most people probably have them, except they forget them, because they forget most of their dreams, and they're often about trivial details. People remember dramatic ones, which are usually much more vivid. I've only done one study myself on precognitive dreams, and that was after the World Trade Center disaster, the 9/11 disaster. Within 3 or 4 days, I had posters up in Union Square, New York, saying, "Did you dream about the World Trade Center?" And I ran a series of ads in the Village Voice, a New York newspaper. I have over 75 dreams from people in New York before the World Trade Center disaster. Some of them are being in planes that crash into skyscrapers, not necessarily the World Trade Center. There were some of that. There were some with the what's it called, that other one, the Empire State Building. Some were in towers in Chicago. So it wasn't specifically that building, but it was crashing. Others were being trapped inside a burning and collapsing skyscraper. And others were being in the streets of a great city with clouds of dust rolling down the street. Those were the 3 main categories of dream that I received. And of course, I don't have a control set of dreams from other days. So it's not completely persuasive evidence, but it was very impressive that with a relatively small effort, I was able to collect dramatically impressive dreams, and several cases where people didn't go to work that day because of the dream or a premonition that something was going to go wrong. So I think precognitive dreams are common, and I think premonitions are also very common in animals. It's been known since classical times that animals can behave strangely before disasters like earthquakes. And in all the I've been tracking the recent earthquakes for the last 30 years, and whenever there's a major earthquake in an area where I can have people I know, I've asked them to collect reports. For example, the Assisi earthquake in 1997, I had an Italian research assistant at the time, so a day after the earthquake, I sent her over to Assisi to interview people in Assisi about what they'd seen beforehand. The local papers were already full of stories. A few days before the earthquake, there'd been a problem in Assisi with rats coming out of the sewers and running over the terraces of restaurants, and the restaurant proprietors had complained to the mayor because it was scaring off the tourist trade, and this was highly undesirable, and no one knew why this was happening. There were dogs howling in the night. there were animals behaving strangely in the entire region around Assisi. The same things happened before the 1994 Northridge quake in California and the 87 quake, the Loma Prieta quake in California. Similar things happened before the great Seattle earthquake a few years ago, and before the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami. There were reports from all around the Indian Ocean of animals behaving strangely, elephants going up to higher ground, and so on. Well, it would be possible to have an animal-based earthquake warning system, since practically everyone now has mobile phones and internet access. The only experiments that have actually been done on this were done in China. Starting in 1974, Chairman Mao believed in people's science and set up a system where, based on traditional Chinese stories about animals and earthquakes, peasants and workers were asked to report to local party headquarters if they saw any unusual animal behavior, snakes coming out of holes and things like that. There are a series of traditional signs. And they did so, and these animal signs became extraordinarily frequent in 1975 around the city of Haicheng. And a day before the disaster struck, the Chinese authorities evacuated hundreds of thousands of people from the city of Haicheng, and there was a devastating earthquake which would have killed vast numbers of people. Some were killed because some refused to be evacuated. They continued to do this with considerable success. There were one or two false alarms, there were one or two that they missed, but in the 70s and 80s, the Chinese were the only people who'd ever forecast earthquakes successfully, and it was mainly using animal signs, also other things like unusual behavior of wells and the water in wells, traditional beliefs which turned out to be true. When China opened up and Chinese scientists started going to international congresses on earthquakes, the Americans and the others just laughed at them. You know, they said, oh, you've been taken in by folk superstitions, this is only just folklore, it doesn't really happen. And I think a few are still doing it, but they're no longer emphasizing it because they don't want to lose face in international geological congresses. But in fact, it should be exactly the other way around. The rest of the world should be learning from China. And I think early warning systems for earthquakes could easily be set up in California and Greece and Turkey and India and Pakistan and many other countries prone to earthquakes using these animal methods. And again, one couldn't say that it's every day that you get earthquakes, but we're talking about something that historical records going back over 2,500 years and countless stories from all the recent earthquakes suggest this would be very feasible. It's not just earthquakes. During the Second World War, many animals in Britain were giving warnings of German air raids, at least half an hour before the air raid sirens went off and the official earthquake warnings occurred. And when my book, I describe all this in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. When this was published in Germany, I launched an appeal in Germany for stories and got exactly the same kind of stories about British and American bombing raids on Germany during the Second World War. In one case, particularly sad case, there was an Austrian who wrote in saying that he'd been imprisoned by the Gestapo for saying a few rude words about the Führer. And he'd been given the job in Bochum in the Ruhr of defusing unexploded bombs. And he lived in the police headquarters, in an attic in the police headquarters. And he had a lonely life there, and he made friends with the pigeons that lived on the roof. He fed them. And he noticed that the pigeons would go away before air raids. And he started telling people when air raids were going to happen. He was so accurate. He was rearrested by the Gestapo and accused of being in collusion with the enemy because he had advanced knowledge of these air raids. The animals also given warnings of terrorist bomb attacks. And in the NATO actions against Serbia, when there was the bombing of Serbia, in the zoo, the animals were behaving strangely and giving warnings of bombing raids. So this is still going on. So it's not just animals picking up seismic vibrations from the earth beforehand. It's much more like a precognition or premonition effect. Now, presentiment is more short-term, feeling the future. Everyone here is probably familiar with Dean Radin's work and Dick Bierman's work on presentiment with erotic images or emotionally arousing images, where if you're about to see a randomly selected image, the ones that are emotionally arousing cause emotional arousal as measured by electrodermal skin response. But this response begins about 5 seconds before the image appears on the screen, and indeed 5 seconds before it's actually selected at random. Daryl Bem has worked on non-physiological experiments of this kind in his Feeling the Future studies. I myself think that these presentiment effects are probably extremely common, and I think one of the areas they probably work all the time is in fast sports. If you're skiing downhill at 60 miles an hour and you go round a corner and there's an obstacle in the way, you have very little time to react. If you have a presentiment and you become more vigilant and so on, you might survive better. If you're playing cricket and there's an Australian fast bowler bowling at 100 miles an hour, you just don't have time to compute when the ball leaves his hand, the time it's travelling through the air. You don't have time to compute the trajectory of the ball, the angle at which it's going, whether it's spinning or not. And the normal theory is you just get the sensory information, it goes through your eyes, clunky processing in the brain, impulses down the nerves, so you get the right muscular responses. You can't do it soon enough. I think that this kind of presentiment is involved in sports, in fast sports, all the time, and the same would be true of ping pong. And it could be studied in those contexts. And actually, sports psychologists have lots of money because it's that competitive edge that makes all the difference in international contests. And in places like Russia and Australia, there are huge budgets for sports psychology. And I think if we could get that kind of phenomenon examined in those contexts, it would be boost this field of research enormously. I think the same would be true in video simulations, in flight simulations. If you're learning to fly, or in driving simulations, you're learning to drive, or you're driving in some driving type video game, if you introduce crash scenarios where something's suddenly coming towards you in a virtual space, it might be possible to measure presentiment effects to those emotionally arousing events. And it might even be possible to have physiological monitors that activate, say, a red light in the cockpit of a jet plane that's flying supersonically, so that if something's about to happen that could be disastrous or potentially disastrous, the pilot will be actually alerted to that and become more aware. I think that these responses are probably very widespread and very deeply physiological in humans and in animals. If you have a presentiment of an attack by a predator and you're emotionally ready, your adrenaline's already pulsing, your heart's already beating faster before it happens, if you've had 5 seconds warning, you'll escape better than if you don't. And finally, I want to turn to a phenomenon that's extremely well known, which is not normally thought of as a psi phenomenon at all, but which I think is, and that is waking up just before the alarm clock. How many people here have had the experience of waking just before an alarm clock goes off? Well, that's almost everybody. I think this is one of the commonest of all phenomena. And most people assume, oh, it's just an internal clock. But actually, our internal clocks aren't that good. I've been doing experiments where I ask people at random times in the day, what time is it now? And it's amazing how inaccurate people are. I mean, I'm more accurate than most because for years I didn't have a watch at all, and I got to be quite good at judging the time. But most people, even if they've got watches or look at clocks on the wall from time to time, can be out by half an hour during the daytime. And there's nothing in our evolutionary history that would prepare us for being able to precisely time our waking up it was only the invention of railways and airlines and work schedules and clocks that meant that people woke up at particular times. And those watches and clocks didn't become widespread in people's homes till the 20th century, in some parts of the world even till the 21st century. And it's simply, in traditional rural societies, people are not particularly accurate about time. They're notoriously late or lackadaisical about time. It's only industrial civilization with railway schedules that made this necessary. So there'd be nothing in our evolutionary history that would prepare us to wake within 2 minutes or a minute of an alarm going off. But presentiment might well work exactly that way. An alarm is an alarm. The Italian word is allarme, to arms. Pick up your weapons, there's an attack. An alarm is a signal of something emotionally arousing and alarming. You're fast asleep, you're having a wonderful dream, perhaps precognitive, and then the alarm goes off. It's a huge jolt physiologically to the system. So I think that waking before alarm clocks is probably an example of presentiment. I haven't been able to do the conclusive experiments yet. I've only persuaded one person to act as a subject for that, Michael Nahm, who's a psychical researcher in Germany. He did this when he was a student, but he got randomly timed calls during the night from me, telephone alarm calls. But after 3 or 4 days, he wrote to me and said, "Oh, dear Rupert, I'm going to have to stop doing this. My girlfriend said she'll leave me if I continue this experiment." So I tried another tack. I put out an appeal through the media to find out how many people had found that they'd woken up spontaneously before a fire alarm went off or some other alarm that they hadn't programmed themselves. And I've got quite a number of cases, a few dozen, where people have woken just before alarms that are not ones they'd programmed themselves. J.W. Dunn noticed this phenomenon himself and said that what he thought it was a presentiment of looking at the clock and seeing the time. A lot of people have found they can actually dispense with the alarm clock. They can say to themselves, wake at 8:30, and they wake at 8:29 or 8:30, even without an alarm. I think that the reason they can do that is when they wake up, they look at the clock, and there's feedback from the presentiment of the clock being at a particular time. That could be tested by creeping into their room at night and changing the clock to see. So these are all totally testable possibilities, I think that this is, as I say, a very common phenomenon. Another way it could be tested is I tried this with our cats, so unsuccessfully so far. Again, my wife thought it was very unfair that I put loaded alarm clocks near sleeping cats to see to see whether they'd wake up just before they went off. Anyway, in principle, this is a whole line of research which is completely unexplored. And which could be widely researched. This fits in with an approach by James Carpenter in his book First Sight, where he thinks a lot of psi phenomena come about through a kind of scanning of the future. We're always scanning the future to see what we should react to, what's going to happen. And psi is not, sensory inputs are part of this too, it's not just psi, but it feeds in, these presentiments feed into this first sight hypothesis of this scanning and vigilance of the future. And this again is part of our animal nature. It's not specifically human. So finally, in conclusion, the point I'm trying to make is that these psi phenomena are normal, everyday, biological phenomena that have evolved as part of human nature and part of animal nature. We share all of these in common with animal species. And they're not weird, spooky, paranormal, ectoplasm, green lights, weird music, ghosts and stuff. Those indeed are part of psychical research, but they're the kind of wilder fringes of psychical research. I think the mainstream of psychical research should be about these normal phenomena. And I think when we do that, And when you talk to people about these things, I find that if I meet people who say, oh, I'm a skeptic, I don't believe in ghosts, I say, well, have you ever found you wake before an alarm clock? And almost always they say yes. And then you say, well, how do you think that might happen? Or have you ever felt you can tell when someone's looking at you? Or have you ever known when somebody's calling you? Almost everyone says yes. And then they say, well, how could we investigate that? And you get into a discussion about experiments, about research. And this defuses this hostility and these great defensive reactions people have in all this kind of witchcraft-based fear and so forth. And I think when we do that, psychical research will become part of normal biology and psychology. I think it's a mistake for us to call things paranormal, and actually, personally, I prefer the Society's newsletter to change its name from the Paranormal Review. It was changed from, it used to be called the Psychical Researcher. When Richard Wiseman was editing it, he changed the name. I think it was Richard who changed it to the Paranormal Review. And I think it gives the wrong message. It may not be a terribly important issue, but I do think that it's very, very important for us to normalize this field of research. And then instead of this being a kind of fringe on the outer fringes of science, and something the media will only treat with either in a sensational way or with extreme skepticism, we'll find that practically everybody is really interested in these phenomena because they've experienced them themselves. And what we have to offer is research on some of the most fascinating aspects of psychology and biology, which open up whole new ways of looking at animal behavior in the wild, evolutionary development of these things, and the way that minds work and the way they're scanning the future and responding to others. So I personally am very optimistic about the future of this whole field of research, because I think that after over 100 years in the wilderness, or 140 years in the wilderness, this could all relatively easily and quickly be normalized and become, enlarge our normal understanding of psychology and biology. Thank you.